Morning, January 16, 1943, Portlands. Harbour sits in a hush of winter light, no wind, no swell, the water flat as a sheet of hammered steel. Along the pier, a brand new Liberty ship rests with the quiet confidence of American industry. She is barely 10 weeks old, fresh from the Kaiser yards, her paint still clean, her lines still sharp, her future assumed. The ship is called Schenectady, no alarms ring, no enemy watches from periscope depth. Then, cutting across the calm like a snapped violin string, a hard, dry crack erupts sharp, decisive, wrong in the space of heartbeats. The hull lets go. From deck to keel, the vessel breaks as if slit by an invisible blade. The bow nods one way, the stern bows the other, and men on the pier can only stare as their miracle ship folds in two while still tied to the bollards. That winter, she was not alone. The SS John P. Gaines fractured in fair weather. A T2 tanker, SS Aso. Manhattan built with the same methods, cracked so badly her crew abandoned her in panic. Convinced the sea would finish the job, in 1943 and 1944, more than 2,500 Liberty ships reported serious structural failures, hull cracks, deck fractures, alarming ruptures where no enemy shell had landed. At least 19 vessels broke completely in half. 3 simply vanished. Gone too quickly, even to send a distress call. These were not wartime losses in the usual sense. These were ships, as sailors whispered with gallows humor, committing suicide. America had staked its supply lifeline on the Liberty program. After Pearl Harbor, the nation needed cargo space yesterday. Traditional shipbuilding 8 months per hull could not feed an army spreading across 2 oceans. Henry J. Kaiser, a builder of dams and dreams who had never built a ship, promised speed by reinventing the process. He would make ships like Detroit made cars. Welding instead of riveting, prefabricated sections instead of piece-by-piece assembly, assembly line logistics instead of artisanal craft. By late 1942, Richmond was launching Liberties in an average of 42 days. Newsreels cheered, and so did America. The S. Robert E. Perry set a breathless record: 4 days, 15 hours from keel to launch. Camera crews captured sparks, showering from Woman's, Torches, Rosie's reborn as welders, while narrators promised that production had beaten the U-boats at last. And then the ships began to break, not under torpedoes or typhoon seas, but in conditions that should have been routine. Naval architects were perplexed. Welds tested sound. The steel met specification. The drawings, adapted from British merchant designs, looked respectable on paper, yet Liberty hulls were failing like porcelain cups. Investigations multiplied. Metallurgists peered through microscopes at fractured specimens. Inspectors crawled through dark compartments with gauges and mirrors. Engineers recalculated stresses until chalk dust smeared their sleeves. Theories bred like rivets: bad steel, bad welds, bad design, bad quality control, each accused and defended in turn. Meanwhile, the cracks kept running, and sailor confidence kept falling. Patterns emerged. Cracks often initiated at sharp corners, the squared edges of cargo hatches, the hard geometry of gun mounts, any place where load lines met at right angles. Once started, a fracture could race through a welded shell with terrifying speed, sometimes in seconds, because welding made the hull a continuous structure. Where riveted ships behaved like overlapping scales, cracks snagging at seams and fasteners, welded ships provided a clear highway for the fracture to run. In the cold North Atlantic, things were worse. The same carbon steel that tolerated strain in milder climates lost its ductility near freezing temperatures. It could no longer deform and absorb energy. Brittle steel plus stress concentrations plus long, continuous welds, that was a recipe written for catastrophe. The committees, though earnest, missed something essential. something not in the tables of a specification book, but in the feel of steel itself. Residual stress locked in by the sequence of the welds. Every weld zone expands under the torch, then contracts as it cools. If you join plates in the wrong order, you trap the metal in a cage of tension it will carry for life. In tidy diagrams, this truth hides. On the shop floor, a night shift welder can watch the plates pull and twist as clearly as a tide turning. Her name, in our story, is Bessie Hamill. She works at Richmond Yard No. 3, 8 months on the graveyard shift, long enough to notice that the production sequence fights the steel. Welders are told to start at edges and run long seams straight to the end, or to close one side of a panel before touching the other. The hot metal shrinks as it cools, and the locked-in tension builds like a winch, winding a cable. You can see the distortion, she says. You can feel the plate harden in the wrong places, under your gloved palm. When crews move to the next section, they carry the tension forward, sealing it inside like a flaw in amber. She raises it with her foreman. He waves it away. She's a welder, not an engineer. The sequence comes from the office upstairs. Hamill doesn't stop. She welds test plates on her own time, some by the yard's prescribed order, some by a center outward sequence that lets stress spill toward the edges. The difference is visible to the naked eye. The center out plates lie flat. The others curl like leaves in a drought. In November 1943, she risks a meeting with supervisors, breaking the chain of command. Skepticism greets her at the door, but curiosity keeps a seat open. A manager comes to watch her shift. He sees it. The process is torturing the steel. Every cooling seam tightens a knot, and the pattern of knots leads straight to the very corners where cracks love to begin. In warm yards, the steel forgives. In the 39 degrees Fahrenheit Atlantic, it doesn't. Once voiced, Hamill's insight is simple enough to be radical. Weld from the center of a section outward. Stagger locations to avoid heat pooling. Break long seams into balanced runs so the structure can breathe as it cools. Don't hand the ocean a preloaded spring. The notion climbs the ladder to Henry Kaiser himself. Admitting the process is wrong means confessing that every ship so far carries a structural sin in its bones. It means slowing the miracle machine to retrain thousands, revising shop cards, rewriting choreography. It also means a chance to end the fracture epidemic before it ends men's lives. Kaiser authorizes tests, metallurgists, instrument sample sections. The numbers come back like a slap and an answer. Legacy sequences show residual tensions peaking above 30,000 pounds per square inches at critical corners. Hamill's balanced sequences distribute load with peaks closer to 12,000 pounds per square inches. Same steel, same weld chemistry, only the order of operations changed. The physics snaps into focus. Steel is a crystal, not concrete. Heat makes it swell, cooling makes it shrink. Constraint turns shrinkage into tension. Tension feeds a brittle fracture once the temperature drops, and a corner multiplies stress. Rewind the morning at Portland. If you could see inside the skenctity, you would find miles of meticulous welds and a map of hidden stresses coiled along them, the air dipped below freezing. The steel's toughness slid down with the thermometer. Somewhere near a hatch corner, a little square of convenience, drawn on a drafting table, microscopic failure began. In a riveted ship, the crack would stumble at the next seam. In a welded Liberty, the crack found a runway. What the newsreels had praised as continuity became a single line of failure, from bow to stern. By the time the committees closed their binders, a new question has replaced the old mystery, not what's wrong with the ships, but what's wrong with the way we build the ships. The answer is about to rewrite procedures, redraw corners as curves, and soon name a successor to the Liberty. But that lies ahead. For now, in the winter of 1943, the water still looks calm. The sparks still fly beneath corrugated roofs, and somewhere out in the cold, a watchstander presses a palm to a humming bulkhead and wonders if the ship is singing or warning. By early 1942, America's most powerful weapon wasn't a tank or a bomber. It was speed. The nation that had once built skyscrapers and automobiles now had to build a navy faster than the enemy could sink it. Every day that passed, Allied freighters were going down torpedoed, bombed, or simply lost in the long grey waves between continents. Britain was starving. The Soviet Union was desperate. The Pacific needed fuel, steel, and blood in equal measure. And in Washington, the numbers didn't lie. Unless America could replace her merchant fleet 5 times faster than the Axis could destroy it, the war would be lost before it was truly fought. The solution came from an unlikely prophet of industry, Henry J. Kaiser. He was no shipbuilder. He had carved mountains for dams, Hoover, Bonneville, Grand Coulee, vast projects of concrete and faith. But the logic was the same. Break the work into modules, control the sequence, and never stop moving. If he could tame rivers, he could tame steel. Kaiser walked through his empty Richmond shipyards in early 1941 and saw not docks, but an assembly line stretched to the horizon. "We will build ships like Ford builds cars," he told the Maritime Commission. It sounded insane. Shipbuilding was art precise, slow, full of handcraft and ritual. Kaiser promised automation. Welding would replace riveting. Prefabricated blocks would replace slow, keel-up construction. Each hull would be born not in one cradle, but in a dozen workshops working simultaneously. "Why wait for one piece to finish?" he asked, "when you can build all of them at once?" By 1942, his miracle yards were rising on the American West Coast: Richmond, California, Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington. Men and women flooded in from every corner of the country. Farmers, teachers, students, migrants, mechanics, and mothers. Some had never held a torch before. Others had never seen the ocean. Within weeks, they were learning to weld under the blue glow of arc light. Each trainee received a number, a position, a purpose. The war had turned ordinary citizens into a human machine. What emerged from Kaiser's yards defied imagination. In November 1942, the SS Robert E. Perry went from keel laying to launch in 4 days and 15 hours faster than most families could build a barn. Cameras captured the sparks flying, the cheers rising. Propaganda reels proclaimed, "We can build a ship faster than Hitler can sink one." Liberty ships were being launched at a rate that left even the Navy speechless. A ship every 42 days, then every 10 days, and in some yards, one every week. The Liberty class was the Model T of the seaplane, rugged, ugly, and cheap. They weren't designed to last forever, only to survive long enough to deliver their cargo. A typical Liberty ship measured 441 feet, weighed 7,000 tons, and carried everything from trucks to tanks, from grain to gasoline. Their steam engines were slow but reliable, their hulls squared and simple for rapid assembly. In a world of shortages, they were a miracle. Emergency cargo ships, built from the bones of America's factories. For a time, the system worked perfectly. Convoys filled with Liberties steamed eastward into the Atlantic, weaving between destroyer escorts. The U-boat crisis that had nearly strangled Britain began to ease. President Roosevelt himself called them the ships that won the war. But behind the headlines, small reports began to whisper through the bureaucracy. Cracks forming in decks, seams splitting under light load, strange popping noises in calm seas. At first, the Navy dismissed them as teething issues. Ships were built fast. Some would naturally show flaws. But the cracks didn't stop. They multiplied. In the winter of 1943, a convoy bound for Murmansk lost 2 ships to sudden structural failure. One vessel, the SS John P. Gaines, simply broke in half in smooth seas. Witnesses described it as if the ship exhaled and collapsed. No explosion, no collision, just a thunderous crack, and the sight of steel bending like tin. The stern sank within minutes. 51 sailors died. What frightened engineers most was consistency. These were not random defects, but identical failures repeating under similar conditions. All the ships had been welded, not riveted. All had the same sharp-cornered hatch designs. And all had been built using the same modular, high-speed sequence. The very system that made America unbeatable in production seemed to have created an invisible enemy within the ships themselves. Inside Kaiser's yards, supervisors scrambled to keep morale high. Welders worked triple shifts under Klieg lights. The torch flame reflected on their helmets like stars in a steel sky. But whispers ran along the catwalks. They say another one cracked last week. They say the steel's bad. They say the cold makes it snap. The truth was worse. Nobody knew why. The Maritime Commission formed panels. Metallurgists were called in from universities. Engineers blamed impurities in the steel. The steel companies blamed the welders. The welders blamed the blueprints. By March 1943, the crisis had reached Washington. Congress demanded answers. Newspapers printed rumors of cursed ships. One headline read, "Liberty ships dying of old age at 2 years." Admiral Emery Land, head of the Maritime Commission, called an emergency conference. Henry Kaiser attended, stoic but cornered. "We are winning the war with these ships," one senator snapped, "but we might lose it to their ghosts." Back at Richmond, Kaiser ordered internal tests. Engineers examined weld seams under magnification. They found no major impurities, no missing filler, no skipped joints. Yet on failed ships, the fractures followed an eerie pattern. From hatch corner to deck seam, down to the keel, splitting the vessel like an egg. The welds didn't fail. The steel around them did. It was as if the metal itself had been stretched too tight and was waiting for one cold night to give up outside the labs. The shipyards kept glowing through the night. You could walk the piers at 3 a.m. and see the arc lights burning like a false sunrise over the bay. Men and women welded side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes singing to keep their rhythm. The clang of hammers and hiss of gas torches blended into a heartbeat of steel. America was racing against itself, against time, against the Atlantic, against entropy. Among the thousands of faces was a young woman with calloused hands and keen eyes, Bessie Hamill. She wasn't an engineer or a scientist. She didn't write reports or attend conferences. She worked in yard number 3, welding hull plates by night, watching the same steel every engineer claimed to understand. And she had begun to notice something. None of them had the sequence of the welds, made no sense. Hamill saw her team begin at the edges, working inward, or run a single long seam from end to end without pause. She watched the plates warp and pull under her torch, saw the tension build as if the metal itself was straining to breathe, were locking stress inside it. She muttered to a co-worker. He shrugged. Orders from above. The war didn't allow time for questions. The schedule was everything. Yet Bessie couldn't unsee it. She began marking down notes between shifts, sketches of plates, arrows showing contraction lines, temperature marks scrawled in chalk. She didn't know the physics, but she could feel the steel fighting her. When another Liberty ship cracked apart that spring, she told herself it wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern. And someone had to listen before more ships and men went to the bottom. That night, sparks fell like rain as Bessie finished her shift. She lifted her hood and looked across the bay where the next Liberty ship waited, its half-finished hull gleaming under floodlights. To the world, it was another miracle of modern engineering, a victory in steel. But to her, It looked like a loaded spring waiting to snap. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak up, even if it meant losing her job. Winter 1943. Across the frozen docks of New England, Liberty ships groaned in the cold. Welded seams pinged like brittle glass. Engineers whispered it was the temperature, the North Atlantic biting steel the way it bit flesh. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. The truth was deeper, buried within the molecular heart of the ships themselves, inside the cavernous laboratories of the U.S. Maritime Commission. Samples from broken hulls lay on steel tables under harsh white lights. Each bore a fracture surface that told a terrible story. Not torn metal, but cleaved metal, clean, bright mirror. Smooth planes where the steel had snapped, not yielded. Metallurgists frowned. "This isn't corrosion," one muttered. "This is brittle fracture." The term was clinical, but its meaning was apocalyptic. The metal had failed without warning, like glass dropped on concrete. To the Commission's investigators, it was a nightmare without precedent. Liberty ships had been designed from tried and tested British blueprints. The steel met all Navy specifications. The welds were clean, the workmanship acceptable. But something invisible, something about how these ships had been born, was turning thousands of tons of steel into ticking time bombs. At the Kaiser yards, engineers began their own autopsies. Under magnification, they saw a pattern that repeated across all fractures. The cracks originated at stress concentrators, corners of hatches, the square edges of gun mounts, abrupt weld terminations. Sharp geometry, by itself, was no crime. It was common in older ships too, but the difference lay in continuity. Riveted ships were discontinuous. Every plate was its own island. Welded ships, though, were monolithic. When a crack started, it met no barrier, no rivet, no overlapping joint to absorb its energy. It simply ran. One investigator compared it to a pane of glass. Tap it in the wrong spot, and the whole sheet shatters. And yet, no one could explain why it happened so suddenly. The welds were strong, the plates were thick. The math said they should have survived 10 times the stresses they experienced. But math, it turned out, didn't understand the heartbeat of steel. Then, one evening in Richmond, a supervisor named Tom Ellery came to Henry Kaiser's office with a set of notes not from an engineer, but from a welder. "She's on yard 3, graveyard shift," Ellery said. "Name's Bessie Hamill. Been bugging her foreman for months. Says the sequence is wrong." "Sequence?" Kaiser asked. "Yeah," Ellery said, dropping the oil-stained papers on the desk. "The order the welds are laid down." Kaiser frowned. "That's engineering business." "She's an engineer with a torch," Ellery replied. "And she's got proof." The next night, a small group of engineers gathered in the yard as Hamill worked. Her torch drew blue-white lines along the edge of a steel plate the size of a house wall. As she finished, the plate curled upward ever so slightly, but enough that even the untrained eye could see it warp. "Now," she said, "watch this." She flipped to a second plate, same size, same steel, but this time she began at the center and worked outward, alternating sides like a heartbeat, pausing between seams to let the heat fade. When she finished, the plate lay flat as glass. "That's the difference," Hamill said. "Same welds, same heat, only the order changes." The engineers were silent. One finally whispered, "She's right." To test it formally, Kaiser ordered comparative stress measurements. The results were shocking. Plates welded edge to edge showed residual tensile stresses exceeding 30,000 pounds per square inch. Concentrated around hatch corners, the very places the fractures had begun. Plates welded with Hamill's center-outward method distributed those stresses evenly, with peaks barely reaching 12,000 pounds per square inches. The welds were chemically identical. The physics was not. Welding was not just joining it. was forging time into the metal itself. The sequence determined where stress lived and where it died. Now, the pieces fit together. When steel is heated by a welding torch, it expands. As it cools, it contracts. If that contraction is blocked by surrounding cold metal or by rigid geometry, the stress remains locked inside forever. In warm Californian shipyards, the steel could still flex, but in the North Atlantic, the temperature dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the steel's ductility, the ability to bend without breaking, collapsed. The stored stress had nowhere to go but into a crack. And once that crack began, the welded hull offered it a perfect runway. The failures had a new name: brittle fracture propagation. They weren't caused by weak welds or bad steel alone, but by a deadly combination: residual stress, low temperature, sharp geometry, and continuous welded structure. Each Liberty ship carried millions of invisible stress lines, coiled like springs. When the cold tightened them, even a minor flexing wave could trigger an unstoppable chain reaction. In one case study, the SS Schenectady's temperature at the time of failure was recorded at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Her hull had been welded in early winter, following the standard sequence edges first, center last, locking tremendous internal tension into the plates. The hatch corners, perfect stress concentrators, became the weak points. When the chill made the steel brittle, one microscopic crack formed and raced the entire length of the ship in seconds. No weld broke. The plates themselves did, releasing decades of potential energy in an instant. The implications were horrifying. Every Liberty ship afloat was a potential Schenectady. Congress demanded Kaiser answer for it. Rivals called him reckless, a profiteer who had built too fast. "You've given us mass-produced coffins," one critic spat during a hearing, but Kaiser didn't flinch. He saw in Hamill's discovery not condemnation but a path to redemption. "If the sequence is wrong," he told his engineers, "then we change the sequence." "But that means stopping production," one objected. "Retraining tens of thousands." Kaiser cut him off. "Better stop now than watch them sink later." And so, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Richmond Yard No. 2 halted work. Welding torches cooled. Crews stood idle, confused and restless, while foremen rewrote procedures. Hamill was brought into the engineering office, an unthinkable move for a female welder in 1943 to demonstrate her sequencing methods. Engineers took notes as she spoke, her hands tracing invisible lines of stress through the air. "You let the metal breathe," she said, simply. "Don't cage it in." By December 1943, new procedures were circulating through the yards. Weld from center to edge, alternating sides, never run a continuous seam longer than a few feet, to allow cooling between passes. Balance the heat. Let the structure relax. It wasn't revolutionary metallurgy. It was common sense born of observation, but it changed everything. Kaiser now faced the real gamble: redesign or die. If Hamill was right, the entire Liberty fleet was structurally compromised, and the only way forward was a new ship stronger, faster, safer, a vessel built not for desperation but for endurance. The engineers began sketching. They rounded the corners of hatches. They increased the steel's low-temperature toughness. They incorporated crack arresters, short riveted seams inserted between welded sections to stop fractures in their tracks, and they named this evolution the Victory ship. Production of Liberty, ships slowed, then stopped. But in that lull, a revolution took shape, born not in laboratories, not in Congress, but in the glow of a single welder's torch on a cold night in California. The Liberty ships had been the fleet of urgency. The Victory ships would be the fleet of understanding. Night shift, Richmond, Shipyard No. 3. The arc lamps glare across a forest of scaffolds, their white beams cutting through the fog that rolls in from San Francisco Bay. Sparks rain from hundreds of torches, a galaxy of molten stars in motion. Among them, Bessie Hamill works quietly, her face half lit by the blue flame of her welding gun. The ship she's building tonight doesn't know it yet, but she's about to change how every ship in the world will be built thereafter. By early 1944, the Liberty ship crisis had become the U.S. Maritime Commission's unspoken shame. Too many hulls had cracked. Too many lives had been lost. Official reports spoke of unexplained failures under low-temperature conditions, bureaucratic words masking human horror. But within the shipyards, a new experiment was underway: Bessie Hamill's sequencing method. The woman whose warning had been ignored for months was now at the center of an industrial reckoning. When Kaiser met her for the first time, he didn't see a welder. He saw a kind of engineer born from experience rather than degrees. She spoke without deference or hesitation. "Sir," she said, "you're asking steel to do something it can't. We're welding it like it's a statue, but it's alive, it moves. You've got to let it breathe." Kaiser listened. That was his genius. Not invention, but humility before truth. To the gamble. Stopping production in wartime America bordered on treason. Every minute, a welder's torch sat cold. A convoy somewhere risked running short of supplies. Yet Kaiser understood that speed without reliability was suicide. If Hamill's theory was right, continuing to build under old procedures would doom more ships and more men to the ocean floor. He called his executives together under the glare of the yard's floodlights. "Gentlemen," he said, "we're not building faster anymore. We're building better." The decision hit like a thunderclap. Training programs were launched overnight. Experienced welders were pulled from the line to become instructors. Bessie herself was assigned to lead the retraining at Yard No. 3, where 10,000 workers rotated through 24-hour cycles. It was the first time a woman, and a line worker at that, had ever taught engineering process inside a Kaiser facility. She approached the task with the same calm precision she used on steel. She drew diagrams on chalkboards, showing how stress traveled through welds like ripples in a pond. "If you start here," she'd say, pointing to the edge of a plate, "you trap the energy. But if you start here, the center, you let it go." The workers nodded. They didn't need equations. They'd seen the plates warp under their own torches. The new sequenced welding cards were printed. Weld 1, center seam. Weld 2, opposite side. Weld 3, 90-degree alternate. Never weld more than 3 feet continuously. Cool between sequences. Balance every weld with a mirror pass on the opposite side. Soon the shipyard became a symphony of rhythm and order. Teams moved like dancers: center, side, pause, cool. Even the sound changed. Gone was the frantic, continuous hiss of uncontrolled heat. Now the air pulsed with precision, the steel singing in measured breaths. The Victory redesign. While Bessie's methods transformed the process, Kaiser's engineers were redrawing the product. The Victory ship was born from the ashes of the Liberty's failures. Every flaw became a blueprint for improvement. Sharp corners? Replaced with gentle curves to reduce stress concentration by 60%. Long, unbroken weld seams? Interrupted by riveted crack arresters. Hull steel? Reformulated with nickel and manganese, increasing toughness at low temperatures, the shipyards retooled overnight. Prefabrication shops began building modules no larger than 30 feet, manageable units that could be welded under controlled conditions, then stress-relieved in giant ovens. The sections were then lifted by cranes and joined on the slipways using Bessie's sequences. Kaiser called it controlled chaos. To outsiders, it looked like a miracle of industrial choreography, doubt, and defiance. But not everyone celebrated. Critics accused Kaiser of gambling with the war effort. Congress demanded hearings. Newspapers ran editorials, claiming Victory ship program slows Liberty production, endangers troop supply. Behind closed doors, naval officers muttered that Kaiser had gone soft, that the Liberty ships, flawed or not, were good enough to last the war. Bessie ignored the politics. She wasn't building headlines. She was building ships that wouldn't drown men. Still, she felt the pressure. Supervisors questioned why a welder, a woman, was rewriting the rules of an industry run by men. Some mocked her, calling her the torch prophet. Others quietly thanked her after hours when they saw, with their own eyes, how the new plates lay flat and true. One night, while inspecting a new hull section, she ran her gloved hand along a cooled seam, no buckling, no warping. She smiled faintly. "Feels right," she murmured, "like the steel's sleeping easy." Proof in the furnace. By March 1944, the first experimental Victory ship hulls were ready for testing. Kaiser's metallurgists installed sensors and gauges across critical seams. The data would decide everything, whether Bessie's theory was salvation or superstition. The results were beyond question. Traditional weld sequences produced residual stress readings of 28,000, 30,000 pounds per square inches, particularly near corners and hatches. Bessie's balanced sequences averaged under 12,000 pounds per square inches, a reduction of more than half. The hulls cooled evenly. No distortion. No hidden tension. For the first time in 2 years, the inspectors found 0 crack initiation points. The steel was the same. The welders were the same. Only the order had changed. A revelation. The secret wasn't in the material, it was in the method. Kaiser announced the results personally to the Maritime Commission. "We've built ships that will outlast the war," he said. "And we owe that to the woman who taught us how to listen to steel." The turning tide. By spring 1944, the Richmond shipyards looked different. The chaos of speed had been replaced by precision. Welders now carried sequence cards instead of production quotas. Inspectors measured success not by launch dates but by stress maps. The first full Victory hull took 18 days slower than Liberty records, but infinitely stronger. The skeptics smirked. "So much for Kaiser's miracles," one journalist quipped. Then came the second Victory, 16 days, the third 12. By June, the SS Benjamin Warner was completed, sea-trialed, and certified in 5 days and 11 hours, and not a single crack was found. The critics fell silent. The quiet triumph. When the Benjamin Warner steamed out of the harbour under her own power, Bessie stood on the dock, her hands still smelling faintly of ozone and hot steel. She didn't wave. She simply watched. The ship's grey hull glinted in the morning sun, the weld lines almost invisible. For her, it wasn't about glory. It was about knowing that every man aboard would cross the ocean safely because the steel beneath his feet could now flex and live. Henry Kaiser approached her quietly. "You know," he said, "they'll call these Victory ships my idea." She shrugged. "Doesn't matter, as long as they don't break." He smiled. "They won't." Epilogue of the shift. When Bessie clocked out that night, she passed the rows of Liberty hulls still under repair. Some bore scars where cracks had been cut and re-welded. Others were already scrapped. She paused, touching one fractured plate that had been left as a training exhibit for new welders. Under the floodlights, the jagged edge gleamed like a warning and a promise. In her pocket, folded and worn, was her original hand-drawn sketch, arrows, seams, and circles showing the path of stress through a welded hull. It was smudged with grease and time, but still legible. On the back, in pencil, she had written one line: "Steel remembers how it was made." That night, the yard was quiet, but alive. The torches hissed in rhythm, each one following the pattern shed given them. And in that steady pulse of flame and metal, Bessie Hamel's revolution burned bright, unnoticed by history, but immortal in every weld that held. By spring 1944, the shipyards of America were alive again, but they no longer pulsed with frantic haste. The chaos of the Liberty program had given way to the rhythm of something greater: precision. Out in the Richmond yards, cranes glided like clock hands. Modules arrived like puzzle pieces, and sparks burst in orchestrated intervals across the bay. The Victory ship program had begun not merely as a new class of vessels, but as a rebirth of industrial philosophy. Henry Kaiser's gamble had paid off. The days of build it fast and pray it holds were gone. In their place came a disciplined harmony between design and construction, a partnership between theory and touch. It was an unspoken tribute to the woman who had forced engineers to see what their formulas had missed. Every time a welder glanced at a sequence card, numbered 1 through 47, they were following Bessie Hamill's doctrine: center outward, let it breathe, never rush the steel to the shape of a new ship. The first full redesigns rolled out of Richmond Yard, no 0.2 inches early, 1944. To the untrained eye, the Victory ships looked like Liberties: same long hulls, same boxy cargo decks, same purposeful silhouette. But below the surface, they were a different species entirely. The hulls were longer and sleeker, built for 15 to 17 knots, 3 faster than their predecessors. Their frames were reinforced with redundant load paths, ensuring that if one section cracked, others would bear the strain. Hatch corners were now gracefully rounded, their radius carefully calculated to reduce stress concentrations by over 60%. Engineers had learned that a single sharp corner could triple the local stress. Now every curve, every seam, every weld was part of a deliberate geometry of survival. The hull plates themselves were new-killed steel, as metallurgists called it. It contained a touch of nickel and manganese, its impurities purged by aluminum during smelting. The steel no longer turned brittle at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It could endure near-freezing seas without losing ductility. Laboratory tests showed the transition temperature, the point where steel changes from flexible to brittle, had dropped from 40 degrees to barely 5. The ships could sail Arctic waters without fear. The improvements didn't stop with the metal. Each hull section was now prefabricated and stress-relieved in enormous furnaces, glowing orange before cooling slowly to dissipate internal tension. When the sections were finally joined on the slipways, their welds aligned with natural stress relief lines, not against them. The result was almost poetic ships, built with the wisdom of experience written into their steel. The assembly line that didn't move. Kaiser's engineers reimagined the entire production system. Instead of workers chasing the ship as it slid down the ways, the shipyards became a ballet of modular stations. The ship didn't move. The people did. Teams rotated through precise intervals, 30 minutes of welding, 10 minutes rest, maintaining consistency and preventing fatigue. Each section carried a colored tag marking its welding order. Supervisors walked the lines with clipboards, checking every seam against sequence diagrams. Balance the heat, don't rush the metal, became the yard's unofficial motto. The process was no longer guesswork. It was choreography. One observer from the Maritime Commission described the scene. It's as if Ford built a cathedral instead of a car. Every spark lands exactly where it's supposed to. By May 1944, the yards were reaching impossible efficiency again, but this time without compromise. On May 12, 17 modules representing 85% of a hull were aligned and joined in just 11 hours. The welders followed their sequence cards, like musicians reading sheet music. Every seam was deliberate, every pause intentional. When the ship slid into the bay, it carried not just cargo, but a new kind of confidence, the test of fire. The first of these ships, the SS Benjamin Warner, became legend, from keel laying to sea trials in 5 days and 11 hours. Not as a stunt, but as a fully equipped, battle-ready freighter. When inspectors ran their post-construction checks, they found 0 cracks, 0 distortions, and stress readings within ideal ranges. During sea trials off the California coast, the Warner hit rough weather and came back without so much as a hairline fracture. To the press, it was another Kaiser miracle. To the welders, it was proof. Their hands, their sequences, their patience had turned failure into triumph. As the first victory ships began crossing the Pacific, their reliability astonished the Navy. The old Liberty crews, men who had lived in fear of the hull's ominous groans, now found themselves aboard vessels that flexed and breathed like living creatures. "You could hear the difference," one sailor said. "A Liberty creaked like an old house in a storm. A victory just moved." She talked to the sea instead of fighting it. War and vindication. In the months that followed, victory ships carried the Allied war effort on their backs. They steamed through typhoon seas, through kamikaze attacks, through Arctic convoys to Murmansk where the water froze solid on their decks and not one broke apart. By the war's end, 531 victory ships had entered service. None suffered a catastrophic hull failure. Not one. The statistics were staggering. Liberty ships lost to structural failure. 19 confirmed, 3 vanished. Victory ships lost the same way. 0. Reduction in reported fractures. 98%. Average service life. Nearly double. The math was simple but profound. Each victory ship cost about $2.6 million, 30% more than a Liberty. But the absence of failures, the insurance savings, the cargo preserved, the lives spared paid that difference many times over. Kaiser's critics fell silent. The congressional hearings ended not in reprimand, but in praise. The Navy adopted victory ship procedures as new construction standards. And quietly, within the shipyards, welders began teaching each other a saying that summed it all up. A Liberty was built in a hurry. A victory was built in understanding. The woman behind the weld, Bessie Hamill, never stood before Congress, never appeared in a newsreel. Her name didn't appear on the victory ship blueprints. But those who knew. In the yards, they called her the woman who saved the fleet. When the first victory convoy left San Francisco bound for Leyte Gulf, the foreman of Yard 3 had her sign a section of the hull before launch. In chalk, she wrote 3 words, "Let it breathe." Her hands were scarred from years of heat, her uniform singed and patched, but her expression, hidden deep in the archives of the Richmond Museum, lies a small, oil-stained notebook. Its pages are filled with rough sketches, welding notes, and short sentences written in tight, deliberate handwriting. The curator keeps it in a glass case under soft light. On the first page, in faded pencil, reads, "Weld from the heart outwards. B. Hamill, Yard 3, 1943. It's not an engineering manual. It's a philosophy." Each diagram shows arrows radiating outward from a central line: balance, symmetry, release. It's the same pattern seen in modern finite element stress simulations decades before computers would draw it. Her eyes saw what machines would later prove. The notebook's edges are burned in places, as if it once sat too close to a torch. The curator says welders used to copy its pages by hand, passing them between shifts. A secret gospel, passed from worker to worker, long before the system that bore her name became industry law. The world she left behind. When the last victory ship was decommissioned, the age of steel fleets gave way to aluminum, composites, and automation. But the lessons Bessie taught, sequencing, symmetry, respect for material, became universal. Today, her methods guide not just ships, but the International Space Station, where astronauts use robotic welders following the same stress balance algorithms that she pioneered by hand. The bridges of Shanghai, the pipelines of Norway, the titanium hulls of submarines all bear her invisible fingerprint. Everywhere there is welded metal, there is her echo. Everywhere humans strive to make matter obey. Her question whispers again, why does the steel move? The long reflection, Standing on the deck of the Red Oak Victory, the sun sinking behind the Golden Gate, one can still feel the weight of that question. The deck hums faintly beneath your boots, alive with memory. You realize that this ship, this piece of steel and history, is more than a museum. It's a testament to human humility. War had demanded arrogance. To build fast, to defy nature, to rush. But it was humility, the willingness to listen to the material, to learn from mistakes that won the longer battle. Bessie's insight was a kind of compassion, an empathy for the inanimate. She treated steel not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living partner to be understood, that philosophy has outlived every liberty ship ever made. The quiet immortality. Bessie Hamill never saw her name in print, never gave interviews, never claimed ownership of her revolution, yet the proof of her existence is written across the world in steel bridges, oil rigs, space vessels, and the few aging ships that still rock gently against their moorings. When visitors leave the Red Oak Victory at dusk, they sometimes hear the clang of distant hammers from the old Kaiser yards, now silent and overgrown. Some say it's the wind echoing through the old dry docks. Others, the romantics, believe it's the ghosts of the welders still at work, hammering softly in the dark. Maybe that's how Shed wanted. No monuments, no parades. Just the sound of steel breathing easy. The world she helped hold together, continuing to stand. The final line. In the end, her legacy isn't a ship or a code. It's a principle. That every creation, whether a ship, a bridge, or a dream, must be built with balance. That strength isn't in defiance, but in harmony. That steel, like people, breaks when pushed too hard, but endures when given room to move. Her story proves that the greatest revolutions don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper in the hiss of a torch, the hum of cooling metal, and the quiet breath of a ship that still sails. The ocean is the great equalizer. It forgets names, erases nations, and humbles every machine that dares to cross it. Yet, among the waves, the legacy of one forgotten welder still endures, hidden in the hum of hulls, the rhythm of engines, and the silent strength of steel that refuses to break. The Second World War ended 8 decades ago, but the code of Bessie Hamill lives on. It's not written in marble or etched on memorial walls. It's written in weld lines and temperature gradients, in the invisible mathematics of balance. Her revolution was not just mechanical, it was human. And today, it holds up the world. The immortal standard. Every modern engineer knows the name of the code that governs their work. OSD-1. 1. The structural welding code. It's the unseen spine of civilization, dictating how everything from a skyscraper to a spacecraft is stitched together. Buried deep within that code are procedures now so universal that few ever stop to ask who first imagined them. Clause 5.22 reads, all weld sequences shall be designed to minimize distortion and residual stress. Symmetrical progression and alternating welds are recommended. There it is, her fingerprint, codified into global law. A sentence that sounds routine, yet carries the weight of an entire philosophy. Work with the metal, not against it. When NASA's engineers weld the pressure hull of an Orion spacecraft, they follow the same logic Bessie scrawled in her notebook in 1943. When shipyards in Japan lay down the first seams of a container vessel, they still start from the center and move outward, just as she taught. The code she inspired has survived wars, empires, and eras of technology. Steel still breathes the way she taught it to. From the stars to the sea. At a shipyard in Yokohama, a 21st century cargo ship 1,000 feet long, fully automated, rises in sections. Drones hover overhead, monitoring heat signatures as robotic welders trace perfect lines of molten metal. Each robot is guided by a digital welding sequence algorithm, derived from Victory ship data, a line of code first proven by a night shift welder with a chalk pencil and instinct. thousands of miles above Earth. In orbit, the same principle keeps astronauts safe. When space station modules are welded together, engineers account for residual stress caused by uneven thermal contraction. They balance every weld like a heartbeat: hot, cool, rest, repeat. It's Hamel's method, applied in zero gravity. She didn't live to see it, but her fingerprints are on the stars. The return of the Red Oak. In Richmond, the SS Red Oak Victory still stands guard over the bay. She no longer carries cargo or ammunition. She carries memory. Her hull plates, welded by hands that once trembled with exhaustion and hope, gleam under California sunlight. Visitors walk her decks, unaware that beneath their feet lies the living proof of an equation that changed the world. Heat plus order plus patience equals strength. Engineers who study her construction call her a miracle of balance. Historians call her the last perfect ship of the Industrial War. The welders who visit call her something simpler home each year. On the anniversary of her launch, a bell rings across the shipyard where Bessie once worked. No speeches, no crowds, just a few volunteers bowing their heads in silence. They know what that bell means. It's not just for the ships that sailed, but for the hands that built them. The unwritten medal. Bessie Hamel never received official recognition. There were no ceremonies, no awards. But sometimes, history rewards its quiet heroes in other ways. In 1988, a year after her death, the American Welding Society added a small inscription to the preface of their updated code, dedicated to those whose hands and insight forged the standards we uphold today. Her name wasn't printed, but those who knew smiled. That dedication was for her, the woman who'd seen the truth before science could measure it. Her descendants would later donate her welding mask to the Richmond Museum. It sits in a glass case now dull, scratched, and unremarkable to most. But if you look closely, etched faintly above the visor in her own handwriting are three words: balance, heat, breathe. That mask, more than any medal, is her monument. The world she built. The 20th century's greatest irony is that the age of mass production was saved by an act of slowing down. The world learned that faster wasn't better, smarter was. Today, the principle that saved the Victory ships defines every corner of engineering. Civil engineering. Bridges are now designed to fail gracefully, spreading load like a breathing structure rather than snapping under tension. Aerospace. Jet fuselages use sequenced welds to manage thermal expansion at 35,000 feet. Nuclear power. Reactors are annealed post-weld, just like Bessie's hull plates, to eliminate trapped stress. Architecture. Steel skyscrapers sway in wind because they're built to move, not resist, a philosophy she proved with every seam she welded. She had taught the world a paradox. The strongest structures are those that know how to bend. The human equation, perhaps the truest part of her legacy, lies not in the steel, but in the lesson she gave to the people who build it. In every industry, from shipbuilding to software, her story became quiet gospel. Listen to the worker who touches the work. Henry Kaiser himself admitted it in his memoir. We learned that expertise can wear gloves, not just glasses. That ethos, respect for observation. Humility before the process became the foundation for modern manufacturing philosophies like lean, Kaizen, and total quality control. She had unknowingly written the emotional blueprint for a new kind of industry, one where wisdom flows upward as much as downward, and where craftsmanship carries the same authority as command. In the living code. In 2025, the Red Oak Victory remains afloat, not as a symbol of war, but of endurance. Her hull hums softly at dawn, the welds expanding and contracting with the day's first light. Somewhere in that vibration, the past still speaks. Her steel carries the ghost of Bessie's hands, every line, every seam, every breath of molten light that once traced her thoughts into metal. That hum is her song. If you stand quietly on her deck and close your eyes, you might hear the faint rhythm of a torch, the hiss of cooling steel, the whispered mantra that built a world. Start from the center, work outward, let it breathe. Epilogue: the code that outlived the war. The Liberty ships were born of panic. The Victory ships were born of purpose. The world that followed was born of understanding. Every skyscraper that scrapes the sky, every bridge that hums in the wind, every ship that survives the storm, owes something to a welder who once dared to ask why. Bessie Hamill's name may never headline a textbook, but her truth endures in the code not written in ink, but in steel. And as long as the world builds, that code will live on, because steel remembers. And so do we.